First, I just want to say it's so wonderful to see so many people, including folks we haven't seen in a long time. I see the Lowensteins on Zoom and saying hi to you guys, and others, as well as some SAJ members who are here for the speaker, and I'm so thrilled that you're here this morning. So in your packet is Professor Penslar's bio. So you don't just can glance at it now or look at it later. It's beautiful, amazing, but I didn't want to waste time, I didn't want to take time for that today. So when we leave Egypt, we do not just go alone, we go as an Erev Rav. We go with other people who are part of our community. We've always been, since biblical times, a diverse community of many different types of people, views, and it's always seen, I think, in many times in Jewish history as a positive thing. But we know that after October 7th, there's been increasing divisions in the broader Jewish community and a significant amount of, a wider range of beliefs around Israel, in our Israel and Zionism in our community than we might have on many other topics, whereas the range might be here, the range is much greater. So I was very excited to invite Professor Derek Penslar to come and just tell us how we got here, a little bit about how we got here. He's not here to address October 7th or current events, but really just to give us some insights into what has changed and how and why, and how we might bridge the divides and build our community in that light. So without further ado, I invite Professor Penslar.
Thank you. How this works?
Thanks.
I'm a little on the tall side.
Yeah, that's fine. We can do this.
My grandmother used to say I belonged in the Jewish home for the tall. There we go. Oh, so you're good. Thank you, Rabbi Lauren. Thank you. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Can people hear him?
Can you hear me? There's a very warm feeling here, which is lovely, because my remarks this morning are going to be very much about feelings, about emotions, and the emotions in particular that Jews in this country have had towards Eretz Israel and towards Israel for the last century or more. A tall order for half an hour, but whatever I miss, I'm sure you'll point out to me. I start just by reading to you a couple of poems by Menachem Mendel Dolitsky, who was a Russian Jew who wound up in this country, actually in New York City, in the early 20th century. One is called If I Forget Thee. Zion, my perfect one, Zion, my dear one, my soul longs for you from afar. May my right hand forget its cunning if I forget you, my beauty, until the pit of my tomb shall close its mouth upon me. I will not forget you, Zion. I will not forget you, my perfect one, you, so long as I live, my hope and my calamity. And when I die, my lips will be keening for you, O my beauty, in my grave. A second poem by Dolitsky that he'd written just a couple of years earlier. Arise, O aged mother, put on the raiment of glory. We have returned to you, entwining in your soil. We have brought building tools to you to rebuild your ruins, spades in our hands to open the furrows. Receive, beloved mother, your immortal sons. Make them forget their exile. Show your face to them. Remove the garment of captivity and desire them, for they are your children. Two very different poems with two very different emotional registers. One filled with sorrow, longing, and yearning, and then another filled with joy. And that very much was the emotional underpinning of the Zionist movement when it began 130 years ago. It was not about fear. It was not about fear of pogroms or escape from persecution. If Jews wanted to escape persecution, they went to America. They went to South America. They went to Australasia. They went to Western Europe. But the Zionist movement at its heart was very much about powerful emotions of anguish and love, a very powerful yearning and love. That was not present in the Zionist movement in this country in its early decades. In fact, until 1940, 45 or so, this country, the Zionist movement was almost a footnote. And to the extent there was a Zionist movement in this country, there was very little passion of the sort that I've just described from Menachem Mendel Dolitzky, who, by the way, died in obscurity and poverty in New York City. His poems unappreciated, and by the way, untranslated until this day. I'm the first person to translate them. So it tells you something about Menachem Mendel Dolitzky in this country. During the 1920s and the 1930s, out of 4 million Jews in this country, there were maybe 70 or 80,000 involved in Zionist organizations, almost all of them women, in the Women's Zionist Organization of America, also known as Hadassah. Their Zionism was philanthropic, devoted to the construction of a national home in Palestine for other Jews, for the poor and persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe to have a home. It was a philanthropic Zionism. It was based on an emotion not of love, but of solidarity. An emotion that had very little to do with the land of Israel itself and was mainly a compassion and solidarity with suffering Jews in Eastern Europe. And that sense of solidarity grew much stronger during the Second World War, as the news of the persecution of Eastern Europe and Central European Jewry turned into the horrific, ghastly news of the Holocaust. It's during the 1940s that memberships in Zionist organizations in this country climbed from the 70 or 80,000 to over 1 million. It was by the end of World War II that Zionism had become as normative for American Jewish life as synagogue attendance. Mind you, a lot of American Jews didn't affiliate with synagogues then, but there were about as many Jews affiliated with synagogues and in Zionist organizations. That's how normative it had become. Now, that was solidarity. It was not really love. I've done some work, and because it's Shabbat, I can't show you pictures, but after Shabbat, if you email me, I can email you some cool pictures. Slides of fundraising posters from the 1940s that show, for example, a well-manicured hand with a suit cuff handing a trowel to a gnarled hand with the tattoo of Auschwitz on its arm superimposed upon the map of Eretz Israel. The message was clear: give money so that this Holocaust survivor can go to Israel. And I've studied propaganda films and the like from the era, and it was very much about giving money so that these Jews can go to Eretz Israel. We will stay in the United States. That was the norm. Solidarity, not love. So something changed, though, in the way that American Jews viewed Israel. And there's two theories of love. One is the romantic theory that people fall in love at first sight, and sometimes that happens. But quite often, love develops slowly in time. And that's what happened with American Jews in Israel. During the 1950s and 60s, it crept in slowly. The gradual incorporation of Israel-related themes into Jewish education, into summer camps, the sale of Israeli objet d'art in synagogue gift shops, and then came that jolt of eros in 1958 when Leon Uris published his epic novel, Exodus, which was a hit not only for Jews, but for the American public as a whole, but had a special meaning for Jewish readers. Now, we have quite a generational range today, which I think is really wonderful, because usually when I talk to synagogue groups in the evenings, we get only the people who are my age or older. And it's very important to talk to a multi-generational group. But for people of a certain age, the novel Exodus was life-transforming. The story of the heroic and erotic hero, Ari ben Canaan, what a name, Ari ben Canaan, played by Paul Newman, you couldn't get much hunkier than that, in the movie from 1960. And it's a movie and a book that injected into Israel a sense of eros, a very strong erotic component, which then grew stronger after the 1967 war. Because in 1967, American Jews, who even those before the war who had been relatively indifferent to Israel, were deeply worried that Israel would be destroyed. And when Israel won a stunning victory over its Arab foes in just 6 days, well, to put it simply, American Jews fell in love with Israel. It was also the late 1960s. It was a time of sexual experimentation, a time of lifestyle experimentation. And one can argue that for mainstream America, Israel became a kind of substitute for being a hippie. As John Ruskay, who would later become a major figure in the UJA in the Federation of New York, put it about Israel after 1967, and I'm quoting from an interview with him when he was a teenager in Israel. Israel represented for me, I was a teenager, every idealistic impulse and vision. It was beautiful. It was more egalitarian, or so it appeared, kind of socialist, democratic, diverse, sexy. The land had been recreated. I was becoming aware of the Holocaust. This was but a moment after the Holocaust. Kibbutzim, it was glorious. The disjointed nature of his speech testifies both to the passion with which he is speaking, and I'm sure there are probably several psychologists and social workers in the room, and the rest of you are probably physicians. Right? So, sorry? Lawyers, right, sorry. I'm married to a lawyer, so it's, yeah, both. The mixture of emotions and the power of the emotions just in that interview, or as a somewhat less emotional person, the curmudgeonly genius Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, put it shortly thereafter, the only offense for which Jews can be excommunicated in the United States today is not to participate in efforts to support Israel. Intermarriage, ignorance of the Jewish heritage, or lack of faith do not keep anyone from leadership in the American Jewish community today. Being against Israel or apathetic in its support does. This was the Israel then of the 1960s and 70s that became fundamental to Jewish day school curricula, synagogue life, gap year programs, junior year programs, the incorporation of Israeli songs into the liturgy, incorporating Naomi Shemer into the melody of the Kiddushah, incorporating, I think, Sharm el-Sheikh has now become a melody for Adon Olam, and so forth. It's just this incorporation of Israel into the life of American Jewry was very much a product of the 1970s. But how do you sustain that? How do you sustain ardor? It's a challenge. It's difficult, especially because with time, Israel grew up. By the 1980s and the 1990s, Israel was no longer the young country of kibbutzim and grapefruit and oranges. It was a country that was becoming rapidly urbanized, industrialized, and beginning to develop an enviable high-tech sector. The Israel that I first went to in the late 1970s and early 1980s was graduating from exporting citrus fruit to light industrial products like plastic and swimwear. Fun fact, Israel was the world's largest exporter of swimwear in the 1970s and 80s. And then it moved into medical technology, and then it moved into various forms of high technology, which frankly is not quite as sexy as the image of the kibbutz, the agricultural life, getting a suntan, being productivized, all those things that I went through when I was a young man. It became more difficult to retain that passion, that ardor for younger American Jews. And thus came, in 1999, Birthright, an idea that every Jew, everywhere in the world, not just in America, I'm just talking about America, would get a free trip to Israel for 10 days. How many people here have been on Birthright? Right. So the idea was to send you to Israel for 10 days on a tour where you would be filled with love of the Jewish people, love of Jewish history, and identification with Israel, which also was not entirely missing an erotic element given the presence of the... Did you have hunky soldiers on your tour? Sorry? Right, the hunky soldiers. So I have to tell you something about the hunky soldiers. I have a colleague who is an Israeli political activist who was, he's still quite hunky, but he was a hunky soldier in his day. And halfway through the tour, it turned out that he was, not only was he engaged to be married, he was quite loyal to his betrothed. And his commanding officer said, "Eze bizbuz hakzaot," what a waste of human resources. So Birthright, which has now reached hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout the world, gives young people a charged, emotionally charged experience, as one Birthright participant put it in a wonderful anthropological study of the subject, quote, "Everything seems to have meaning everywhere." And it's really funny because my son, who lived in Israel with me, my children lived in Israel when they were young because I was teaching in Jerusalem. And so they went to regular schools in Israel, and they spoke Hebrew and so forth, but they had never had the Birthright organized trip. In other words, they'd had the reality, but they'd never had the simulacrum. And so my son got a free trip on birthright, which he spent hiking around. And I asked him how it was. He came to visit me. I was living in Tel Aviv at the time. And I asked him, after he finished the trip, how it was. And he says, I had fun, Dad, except I didn't really like the timeshare speech every night. He compared the pro-Israel speeches to a kind of a condominium timeshare speech. And also the very clear encouragement for the young people, you can tell me if this happened to you on your trip, to hook up, where it's like, kids, we're going away, your madrichim are going away for the evening. We're not going to be here. We'll be back tomorrow. That sort of thing. So it was an attempt to recreate and rekindle that kind of love in an era where Israel and the way that American Jews faced Israel was changing, partly because Israel itself was changing in terms of its economic and social development, but also Israel was no longer the young, struggling country against enemies that it had been in 1948 or 1967 or 1973. American Jews had begun to become to be more critical of Israel, more concerned about Israel in the wake of the lengthening occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it was precisely in reaction to criticism of Israel, coming from outside of the Jewish community in this country, but also coming from within it, that for the first time in 2000, Hillel International, which had never taken a stand on Israel, it was only in around 2000 that Hillel proclaimed Israel to be central to its mission. Before that, you could be an anti-Zionist and you could be involved in Hillel. Nobody cared. But it's very interesting how Hillel became more and more connected with Israel with time rather than less and less, precisely in response to growing indifference among younger American Jews towards Israel. There were attempts by some American Jews, even in the 1970s, to adopt a more critical stand. But they made clear that if they were critical of the Israeli government, if they were critical of the occupation, for example, that they were doing it from love. The language that the American Jewish community used from the 1970s well into the 2000s was, if you are going to criticize Israel, you must do so from love. So in 1974, a group of college students, or young people just out of college, formed an organization called Brera, or Choice. Now, Brera consisted mainly of Jewish students from observant backgrounds, Hebrew speakers, who had lived in Israel and knew the country quite well. And they connected with Israeli peace activists, MPs, or MKs, that is, members of the Knesset, in the left-wing parties. And they criticized the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, and they were met with a thundering denunciation by the likes of Arthur Hertzberg, who said, "You do not speak from love." And they replied, "We do love Israel. We have lived in Israel. We speak the language fluently. We are part of the political system in some ways, and you are telling us that we don't love the country." And in the end, Brera was crushed by mainstream Zionist organizations. Very good new book about this by Jeffrey Levin that I can recommend. Does this mean then that criticism never occurred in the Jewish community towards Israel? It did, but in two ways. One is, and Rabbi Lauren, you'll appreciate this, that if you were critical of the Israeli Orthodox rabbinate for its exclusion of non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, the Reform movement, conservatism, and Reconstructionism, if you were critical in that regard, that was acceptable, because that was in-house criticism. You were criticizing something within the state. But to be publicly and openly critical of the country's policy towards the Palestinians, even going into the 21st century, was something that was not publicly allowed, but it happened privately. So, for example, in the 1980s, none other than Philip Klutznick, president of B'nai B'rith International, met Yasser Arafat. These sorts of things happened under the table, quietly, but not publicly. So when did a more critical approach towards Israel and a less loving approach towards Israel begin to emerge? I think it began to happen in the early 21st century. It began to happen at the time of the Second Intifada, when public opinion throughout the world grew increasingly hostile towards Israel. What happened is that younger American Jews, and I'm glad that we have some younger American Jews here with us today, and not just older American Jews talking about younger American Jews. If you look at survey data, which goes back to the early 21st century, we see a very gentle but consistent decline in younger American Jews' emotional attachments to Israel. So in surveys from the early 2020s, something like 90% of American Jews claim to have an emotional attachment to Israel. But if you looked at people under 30, it was about 25% were strongly attached and another 35% were modestly attached. And when you realize that Orthodox Jews make up 17% of all younger Jews in this country, Orthodox Jews are 10% of the entire demographic, but 17% of those under the age of 21. You realize that those American Jews who have the strongest attachments to Israel are usually Orthodox. And among non-Orthodox Jews, and again, there might be exceptions in this sanctuary today, we have to remember that everybody is their own unique person and that your experience might not speak for 6 million or 6.5 million other people. But across the board, there has been definitely an emotional cooling. Now, does this mean that younger American Jews have turned hostile to Israel? Well, that's a really interesting question, because over the last year and a half, there certainly have been Jews at major universities like Columbia or the university on the Charles River where I teach, or other universities and small colleges where there have been Jewish students very involved in pro-Palestinian protests, demonstrations, encampments, and the like. But if you look at the survey data, the numbers haven't changed that much. That before 2023, 2024, as today, about 10 to 15% of younger American Jews believe that there should not be a Jewish state. That number hasn't changed much in the last 10 to 15 years. It didn't change after 2023, after October 7th. So there is a minority of younger American Jews who believe that there should not be a Jewish state. But it is a small minority, and it hasn't changed that much. What has happened that's much more, I think, powerful and significant is the factor of emotional cooling. And again, I'll hear from younger people in a little while about how cool or uncool you have felt towards Israel. I think that at Harvard I actually get quite a representative sampling of this, and that a lot of my Jewish students at Harvard, they're not anti-Zionist. They're not gung-ho Zionist. They're simply, as my daughter once said when I asked her if she was a Zionist, she said, "Oh, Abba, I'm Zionish." Right? They have some connection, but they're troubled. They're troubled about what's been happening in Israel. And I think that sense of trouble extended from young people to an older demographic, starting with 2022. You see that my talk was called From Love to Anguish. So I've been talking about various forms of love, very powerful support for Israel, incorporation of Israel into synagogue life, the school system, and so forth, that to be a good Jew, you have to love Israel. How and when did that begin to change among the Jewish community as a whole? I don't know how many of us remember just what November of 2022 meant, because it's been supplanted in our collective memory by the horrors of October 7th and its aftermath. But remember what happened, perhaps in this community, but I do a lot of synagogues, a lot of speaking in communities, and there was a real change in the non-Orthodox North American, I say that because I'm a Canadian as well as an American, we have to acknowledge our friendly neighbor to the north, soon to be your 51st state, which means, by the way, with 10 provinces and 20 senators, you will now have free health care, gun control, gay marriage and abortion on demand. Just letting you know that there's advantages to being part of Canada. In November of 2022, Israel went to elections for the 5th time in a few years and elected a strongly right-wing government that explicitly made the annexation of the occupied territories to be a governmental goal, and that had in its cabinet avowed, non-apologetic Kahanists, that is, disciples of the late extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane. There was no rationalization, there was no attempt to pretty this up. There was no euphemism. The Israeli government was clearly a right-wing, highly populist, and highly militant government, and this is what the government coalition became. Now, within the United States, for the first time, at least my living memory, I began to see expressions of concern even from the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, not AIPAC. AIPAC said this, we celebrate Israel's tradition of democratic elections. Because it's true, Israel did have a free and fair election. Israel does have free and fair elections that brought this government to power. So they celebrated democracy as such. But I started hearing from communities in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, everywhere, expressions of real concern among Jews who loved Israel. But the Israel they loved was a democratic state, a state that had a separation of powers, a state that had an independent judiciary, a state that protected the rights of all of its citizens, Arab and Jewish. These are people who had somehow not been flummoxed by the 2018 Basic Law in Israel, which claimed that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and no other, and essentially subordinated the Arabic language and Arabs as people. Somehow that basic law managed not to upset American Jews, but the elections of 2022 did, because it became absolutely obvious that an American conception of liberal democracy did not characterize the policies of the Israeli government. Now, there were American Jews who supported the judicial, what was called the judicial overhaul or the judicial plans. Again, Orthodox American Jews, 75% of them to this day, strongly support the state of Israel in any form. Many Orthodox American Jews believed that, in fact, the court had become a bastion of interference in the political life of the country, particularly protecting the rights of Palestinians. There were Jews in this country who celebrated the judicial proposal. But in the conservative and the reform and the Reconstructionist communities that I know, the reaction was quite concerned. And I began to hear a new word. For the first time in my 4 decades of living in and working about Israel, I began to hear the word anguish. People were speaking about not just loving Israel, but feeling anguished by what was going on. Anguish is an interesting emotion. You don't feel anguished about something to which you're indifferent. You only feel anguish when you love something and you worry for its well-being. And American Jews began to say the word anguish. You began to see it in public opinion. There was an essay by, I think it was Hillel Halkan, a staunch Zionist, American Zionist who moved to Israel many decades ago. He wrote about anguish. I saw that term more and more. And that kind of concern, right, that kind of worry or trepidation became stronger and stronger. And then it simply, it kind of disappeared then with October 7th. It disappeared because of a different kind of anguish. The anguish of horror of the Hamas massacre, the 1,200 deaths, an anguish that I think we're all still processing. But what happened after October 7th is that that critical edge, which had begun to characterize American Jewish public life towards Israel, it largely vanished. Certainly in the mainstream Jewish organizations. Instead, rallying around the flag, supporting Israel, raising money, trying to defend Israel against its enemies and so forth. But it's different this time. We now have, unlike the 1970s, we now have at least one organization in the Jewish world that attempts to be both mainstream and mildly critical, and that's J Street, which was founded in 2008. And unlike Brera in the 1970s, J Street was founded by grown-ups, and it was founded by people who do not have the money, and they do not have the clout of AIPAC. Not close. But J Street is recognized as a legitimate philanthropic and political lobbying organization, not a philanthropic organization, in the American Jewish community. There's a bit more purchase in the American Jewish community today for this kind of critical approach towards Israel. But by and large, I think that since October 7th, American Jews have been dealing with not only the grief and the trepidation for Israel itself, but also a sense of abandonment by their own peers for those many American Jews who identify as liberal and progressive. Because after all, after October 7th, many people on the left in this country, in the progressive political camp, either justified the Hamas-led massacre or they rationalized it, defended it, and sometimes even celebrated it. And that sense of betrayal was a cause of yet another kind of anguish, I think, for Jews on the American left. To this day, the Jewish left in this country is divided. There are those who feel betrayed by October 7th and in the support that it received in much of the world. And then there are those who actually remain critical of Israel and do find their own ways of rationalizing October 7th. For example, Jewish Voices for Peace, an organization founded in 1996, was until 2023 quite small, maybe 10,000 members nationwide, most of them university professors, intellectuals, and other ineffective people. I'm not entirely joking about that. I mean, I realize, being at Harvard for the last 10 years, I realize who runs the world, and it's not the Harvard professors. It's the students who will go out and run the world. That's why I'm glad I'm teaching them. Maybe they'll remember something someday when they're in power. But JVP has grown more popular since October 7th of 2023. And JVP is an interesting organization. I'm not saying I support it. I'm just saying I find it very interesting. It has become what I would call, and again, I'm saying this analytically, not critically, I see it's almost like a sect of American Judaism, in that there's a very strong belief in JVP that to be Jewish is to have certain values that require the pursuit of justice for Palestinians. Or as a friend of mine said, it's a promised land, but it was promised to somebody else. And that the emotional energy that Jews have placed into the love of Israel over the decades, JVP has now invested into the desire to save, rescue, and attain liberty and freedom and justice for Palestinians. At Tisha B'Av last year, JVP produced a pamphlet called 21 Stages of Grief, in which every aspect of the Tisha B'Av holiday was repurposed into mourning for the Palestinians. And it's really quite interesting that the entire Jewish tradition becomes marshaled in the service of this cause. Now, again, I'm not judging it. It's not my job to judge. It's my job to try to understand that this is a particular stream, I think a rather small stream, but a particular stream in American Jewish life. I think more normative, much more common, is a sense among more mainstream American Jews that they feel let down by Israel, disappointed by Israel, and that anguish that appeared after November of 2022 has not gone away. I'll give an example. Several months ago, I was in Munich. I was giving a lecture about how Israel traditionally has felt itself to be badly treated by the international community, betrayed by the international community. And after the talk, a very well-established Jewish person, a philanthropist, very connected with Israel-related causes, said to me, "You forgot to mention another kind of betrayal, how we Jews feel betrayed by Israel. We wanted a different Israel, a democratic Israel, an Israel that protected the rights of all of its citizens, and that's not the Israel we have today, and we feel betrayed." So that anguish is still present, although it has been attenuated. The war in Israel will end. All wars end. The cleavages within Israel between those who support the retention of the territories and those who oppose it, between those who sense that there should be no limit to the destruction of Gaza and those who have qualms and feel that there should be a limit. The tensions between American Jews about what kind of Israel they want and at what point they will openly, publicly criticize it. All of those tensions are still present. They've been attenuated because of the savagery of the Hamas attack of October 7th and the war in the last 15 months. But those tensions will come back. So the feeling of anguish then, I think, is not a temporary phenomenon. The feeling of anguish will only disappear if American Jews stop loving Israel and if they become simply indifferent to it. I do not believe that the greatest threat facing the American Jewish community today in its relationship with Israel is hostility or hatred or young Jewish people wearing keffiyehs and marching for Palestine at Columbia or Harvard University. That's not where I think the greatest threat is. The greatest threat is indifference. The greatest threat is apathy. As long as people feel anguish, they're capable of feeling love. Shabbat Shalom.